Hi everyone, Samir and Sumet here, and welcome back to our Formula One podcast.
Today we'll be talking about the 2023 Sao Paulo Grand Prix.
And this was definitely an exciting weekend again, as we've been seeing so far.
Yeah, Sao Paulo always produces some
Yeah,
really good racing and really good overtaking. And once again this year it was really nice.
yeah, especially with this weekend being a sprint weekend as well, there was increased action as well.
Yeah, it was almost like we got like double the action because not only
Yeah,
was the sprint race eventful but also the actual race too.
yeah. So going on into FP1, Ferrari would be looking to bounce back after their kind of disappointing run of form recently. With Red Bull sealing up both championships, Ferrari would be looking to make a statement, and they certainly did in FP1 after setting a 1-2 in free practice one.
They also set a 1-2 in qualifying, remember? So they
Yeah,
seem to have the qualifying pace, just not
yeah,
the actual race pace. So
yeah.
again, it was like kind of, oh, they got 1 and 2, but can they actually keep that into the race?
Yeah, and we saw Carlos Sainz was the top man at Ferrari as he took the quickest time ahead of Charles Leclerc. Then we saw the Mercedes also looking pretty quick. Of course, George Russell the winner here last year and Mercedes taking a 1-2 here last year. So Russell was definitely on it. He finished the session in P3 and Hamilton finished the session down in um Hamilton finished the session down in P12. So Hamilton wasn't looking that quick, but Russell definitely was.
Yeah, I mean, Russell obviously won here last year, and so
Yeah,
Mercedes got a 1-2 here last year. So
yeah,
they obviously know this track well. Red Bull were like surprisingly off the pace.
yeah,
But like I think it was just different run plans
yeah,
because like this qualifying session or this practice session was really busy because it was the only one they would have this
yeah,
weekend. So there was a lot of different run plans everywhere, and so the
yeah,
track was really busy. And we saw a lot of like we saw traffic there, and we saw Lando Norris
yeah,
try to go down the inside of Nico Hulkenberg at turn 12, and Hulkenberg didn't like see of Norris and kind of turned into the McLaren, and so
yeah.
that maybe caused a little bit of damage, but ultimately wasn't too bad.
Yeah, Hulkenberg also said that he had like a slight loss of power as well and was moving slowly around the track.
Yeah, so it was kind of dangerous and required better communication with the race engineers, but ultimately it was like it didn't affect anyone.
Yeah, we also saw the Alpines looking pretty quick as well. Well, in the hands of Pierre Gasly, it seemed because he was up in P7. Lance Stroll was also up there in P6. But Hulkenberg, even despite his power issues, was still able to finish the session in a respectable P4. Albon was up there for Williams in P5, and Sargent was also up there in P9 for Williams. So obviously, we know there are some long straights on the Sao Paulo tracks, and Williams, we know they love their long straights.
Yeah, so there were kind of a lot of cars looking quick, like as you
Yeah,
mentioned, Williams looked quick. However, what was really funny was that like Sargent, he was complaining that
yeah,
in one stage like his tires were lifting off the ground
yeah,
in some of those off cambered corners,
yeah,
and so like it was like really strange to see because he was three wheeling around the infield, but
yeah,
Williams got their suspension geometry fixed.
yeah. And we also saw Max Verstappen having some issues with his seat, saying it was flexing and it was moving around a little bit, so it wasn't installed correctly. So he said that they could fix it though after the run. It was not an emergency to box immediately.
Yeah, exactly. But in the end, it was Carlos Sainz first and Charles Leclerc was second, so
Yeah,
1-2 for Ferrari in practice. Then came Russell third, followed by Hulkenberg. A great effort from him to get fourth in the half.
yeah,
Then Albon came fifth, followed by Stroll, Gasly, Joe Guan Yu, Logan Sargent in the top 10, and then
yeah.
Kevin Magnussen in 10th.
Yeah, so both Red Bulls not up there in the top 10, which was very
Yeah.
surprising to see.
I think it's just run plans, though.
Yeah. So now moving on into qualifying then on that Friday afternoon because this is a sprint weekend obviously. So this qualifying would set the grid for Sunday's Grand Prix. And immediately we saw towards the end of Q1, Leclerc was the quickest man out there and Piastri was up there in P2. So now and Stroll was up there in P3. So Sainz was trying to get a lap together and move himself higher up the grid, but he only managed P6. So it was a decent enough probably to get through out of Q1, but definitely not to fight for pole later on. We also saw Logan Sargent now come to cross the line needing a lap to get out of the bottom five, and he did so, putting his Williams up into P15. But others behind were certainly improving, such as Nico Hulkenberg, who blitzed the first sector, and he was looking very good. As Russell crossed the line, he went up quickest overall, so the track was now starting to improve rapidly. And as Hulkenberg crossed the line, he went up into P3. So now drivers had to hurry and get a lap together.
Yeah, and then the track was like greatly improving, and also there was a severe risk of rain, so
Yeah,
that's why drivers wanted to get runs in early.
yeah,
And what was interesting was that the Red Bulls were only 7 and 8
yeah,
before the final run, so they weren't looking extremely quick. However, it
yeah,
could have just been like Q1, oh, we're not gonna push that hard, but the Red Bulls
yeah,
were falling towards the end, and
yeah,
as you say, after Hulkenberg went third, other drivers were improving, and one of them was Daniel Ricciardo, who needed a lap in to get out of the
yeah,
bottom five, and Ricciardo, he only managed 16th. So after how well he did in Mexico, it was disappointment for
yeah,
him as he stayed 16th, and by six thousandths of a second, he
yeah,
couldn't beat Sonoda out of the bottom five. And Sonoda, he crossed the line and he couldn't improve on his 15th. And Esteban Ocon went up into 14th and knocked out Sonoda. So both Alpha Tauris were knocked out by the slightest of margins out of Q1.
yeah. So the five that we lost from Q1 were Yuki Tsunoda, Daniel Ricciardo, Valtteri Bottas, Logan Sargent, and Joe Guan Yu. Surprisingly, both Alfa Romeos out and both Alpha Tauris out.
Hmm. So now going on into Q2, we saw as we approached the final runs, Kevin Magnussen, who was in the bottom five, he couldn't improve his time, and he went slower by 6 tenths of a second.
Yeah.
So it was not at all a good improvement for him.
Last year's pole sitter.
Yeah, exactly. Last year's Polster couldn't get out of the bottom five this time. Then Esteban Ocon, he didn't have a good first sector, and that cost him and his third sector. So
Yeah,
Ocon couldn't improve out of the bottom five, and he stayed 12th. Hamilton stayed sixth, so the track was not improving
yeah,
as much as Q1. Gasly only improved up to 13th, so it was disappointment for both Alpines
yeah,
as Charles Leclerc crossed the line and he only went up to seventh. So it was looking now all of a sudden that McLaren was quick in Lando Norris's hands, but and the Red Bulls were starting to find more pace,
yeah,
and it looked like surprisingly Ferrari had dropped off. I think the
yeah,
colder track conditions didn't suit them as well.
yeah. So the five we lost from Q2 were Nico Hulkenberg, Esteban Ocon, Pierre Gasly, Kevin Magnussen, and Alex Albon. Surprisingly,
So as we started S or Q3, the clouds got incredibly dark,
yeah,
and so the drivers had to get laps in quickly
yeah,
because it looked like it would like pour at any moment.
yeah,
So Verstappen set out on his lap time first, and all the drivers were following suit behind him,
yeah,
and it looked like the clouds were extremely dark and looked like it could rain at any
yeah,
moment. So Verstappen set the pace with a 110.727, and that was the rest for the rest of the challenge. George Russell was extremely off the pace in the 111s. No one could
yeah,
get close to Verstappen. It was probably just tire difference until Leclerc
yeah,
came, and Leclerc missed out by 2 tenths provisionally, and
yeah,
everyone else was just on old tires too. So it was extremely slippery for them,
yeah,
and it was extremely slippery for Oscar Piastri, who was pushing hard at turn 12, and he found no grip as he
yeah,
applied the brakes and went straight on into the grass, and that compromised Sergio Perez because Perez was caught under yellow flags. I don't know
yeah,
why Red Bull left Perez out that late
yeah. I don't
though.
know why either.
But that ultimately cost Perez, and he only stayed ninth fastest out of the nine that had set a good time.
Yeah. So the after that, before the second runs, it started pouring rain. So that was it for the runs. And so the final order for qualifying was the Max Verstappen was on pole position. Then Charles Leclerc was up there in P2, and Lance Stroll was up there in P3 for Aston Martin. And it wasn't just Stroll up there; Alonso was up there as well. So Aston Martin's locking out the second row, a really good result and a much needed result for them.
Yeah, it
Then
was
came
really impressive from
yeah.
them.
Then came the Mercedes on row three of Hamilton in fifth, then Russell in sixth, then came Norris and Sainz in seventh and eighth, then Perez and Piastri to complete the top 10.
Going on into the sprint shootout now.
Yeah,
This would set the grid for the sprint race, And in SQ1, as we approach the final runs, there were
Yeah,
a bunch of drivers that needed to get out of the bottom five. Well, actually, there's five drivers that need to get
yeah,
out of the bottom five. But one of those wasn't Charles Leclerc, but Leclerc couldn't improve his time that well. He stayed seventh. Yuki
yeah,
Tsunoda was 19th, and he did not want a repeat of yesterday, so he needed to get out. But he only improved to 15th, so he was at risk from the two Williams of Logan Sargent and Alex Albon. And just as we thought they would improve their times, we
yeah,
saw Esteban Ocon crash at the exit of turn three, and that
yeah,
would definitely bring out the red flag because
yeah,
Ocon had major damage and he had to stop the car. And
yeah,
then we saw Fernando Alonso kind of trailing with a puncture and damage on his front left,
yeah,
and so we wondered what that was about, and we found out Alonso was on the outside of turn
yeah,
three trying to let Ocon by, and Ocon he looked like he got oversteered and then oversteered into Fernando Alonso.
yeah.
Later, Ocon said he didn't have oversteer and that it wasn't his fault, but Alonso said it was Ocon's fault.
I
Personally,
think that was Ocon's
yeah,
fault. Yeah,
personally, I think it was Ocon's fault because he got oversteered. Alonso maybe could have left more space, but I think it was still
yeah,
Ocon's fault. But that ultimately ended the session early, and so Sargent and Albon lined up on the back row. Joe Guan Yu couldn't improve his time. Lance Stroll, who was P3 for
yeah,
qualifying, was 17th for SQ1, and Esteban Ocon after crashing out was 16th.
yeah. So now moving on into SQ2 then, and the final set of runs, it was Max Verstappen who was the quickest currently, and he improved his time by even further. And we saw Valtteri Bottas who needed a time to get through to the next part. As he crossed the line, he went up into P7. So but there were still four drivers who needed to set a time, so Bottas would definitely still be at risk. As Sonoda crossed the line, he went up into P6. So Bottas was pushed further down the order. Then came Ricardo to try to improve his time, and Ricardo, as he crossed the line, he went up into a very impressive P2. That was very good from Daniel Ricciardo, just a tenth off Max Verstappen. So Bottas now was the driver at risk. So then came Pierre Gasly to set a time, and he went up into P10, pushing Bottas out of qualifying. But Gasly was now the driver at risk in P10. Then came the Mercedes to try to improve their times, as we saw Sergio Perez go all the way to the top in P1 ahead of Verstappen, which is something we haven't seen a lot of so far this year, except the beginning part of the year, back when Perez was the title contender. Then we saw Lewis Hamilton who crossed the line and went up into P4, and now that pushed Pierre Gasly out of qualifying. So very disappointing for Alpine to have one car out in SQ3 and one car out in SQ2 now. Then as Russell crossed the line, he went up into P5 just behind his teammate, but both Mercedes couldn't beat the AlphaTauri of Ricardo, but Norris could beat both Red Bulls and everybody there as he went up into P1. So the track was now starting to improve rapidly, and now Sonoda was a driver at risk, but he would still be good enough for him to get through.
So the five that we lost from that session were Fernando Alonso, who was 15th and
Yeah,
couldn't set a time because of his damage. Then came Valtteri Bottas, Pierre Gasly, and then both Hasses, Hulkenberg 12th and Magnussen
yeah.
11th.
So now moving on into SQ3 then. In the final set of runs, it was Piastri looking to set a time now, as he would be the first one to cross the line, and he was flying, but so was Max Verstappen, and the wind had started to pick up, so drivers had to be mindful of that now so that they wouldn't lose the rear, because what the wind can do is it can throw you off on some corners if you are like taking the corner on the opposite direction or even the same direction as the wind.
Kick out crosswind.
Yeah, that can like move your car and cause like the rear end to step out.
Because these cars are so like delicate with how they
Yeah.
handle aerodynamics.
Yeah, so now as Piastri crossed the line, he set a time of a 111.1, but then came Lando Norris, who beat that time by quite a big margin. He was set a time of a 110.6, and then came the Red Bull of Max Verstappen, who surprisingly couldn't beat Lando Norris's time. So it was very surprising to see from Max Verstappen. Then came Charles Leclerc to cross the line. He went up only into P3, and we saw Sergio Perez was absolutely flying in his Red Bull. He looks like he found pace, but after he crossed the line, it was only P3 for Sergio Perez, so it wasn't a good result at all for him, as Verstappen was only up there in P2. Then came Carlos Sainz to cross the line, and he went up only into P8. So Ferrari had got it all wrong with their cars and their performance. Then Russell went up to P4. So Mercedes were now fourth and fifth with Russell and Hamilton, and Lando Norris was the man to beat, and he took his second ever pole position in Formula One, his first sprint pole position. So it was a really good result from him.
Yeah, it was an incredible lap from
Yeah,
North to beat both Red Bulls, and we
yeah,
waited to see whether North could finally take a win.
yeah. So we would see that come the sprint race that weekend or that day. So now moving on into the sprint race to see whether Norris could take his first win or whether Verstappen would come back at him. So as the lights went out, it was a good start from Verstappen, who looked to put the pressure on Lando Norris heading into turn one. Verstappen tried or Norris tried to cover off Verstappen, but Verstappen had the inside line and Norris was able to or Verstappen was able to take the lead. And further back we saw several lockups, but everyone seemed to go through unscathed. But then we saw the Mercedes of George Russell take P3 ahead of the Red Bull of Sergio Perez. So heading down the straight now, it was Verstappen from Norris, Russell, Piastri, Hamilton. Then came the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc, I think it was. Then Oscar Piastri.
Yeah, Hamilton, Russell had just gone ahead of Perez, and
Yeah,
Hamilton quickly followed suit into turn four. And Hamilton made a really
yeah,
good move around the outside of Sergio Perez, as we saw Oscar Piastri get it all wrong at turn four and go
yeah,
almost as wide as Max Verstappen did in 2021 to
yeah,
get past and he went off the road, and that allowed Daniel Ricciardo to get ahead of the
yeah,
McLaren. So Alpha Tauri were currently running well too. Sonoda was keeping ahead of Charles Leclerc, so that was mighty impressive from Alpha Tauri.
yeah,
And Mercedes had found an incredible start as Russell tried to send it to the inside of Lando Norris into, I don't remember the turn. I think it was turn 10. Russell sent it to the inside there,
yeah,
and he made a really nice move, and so that Norris had fallen down from pole all the way down to
yeah.
third.
Yeah, and so moving on into lap four, it was we saw Perez now make his move on Lewis Hamilton into turn one. Perez was able to clear one Mercedes. Then we saw the Ferrari of Sainz trying to put pressure on Yuki Tsunoda, but Tsunoda held him off. And now Hamilton had the slipstream and the DRS heading down now the straight in the first DRS zone, and Hamilton was able to try and go around the outside, but Perez just broke that much later and was able to keep that place. And Hamilton had gone slightly deep, which opened the door for Charles Leclerc, and they were now going wheel to wheel through that curved section at the end of the retropasta. And Hamilton now the outside turned into the inside, and Hamilton was able to keep his spot in
Hmm.
P5.
Going on to lap 5 now, Lando Norris finally dispatched George Russell into turn 1
Yeah,
with a pretty simple move down the
yeah,
inside. And on lap 8, we saw Sergio Perez make the same move on George Russell,
yeah,
but this time it was the outside line for Sergio Perez. Russell tried to fight him back though into turn 4, and Russell made it stick around the outside. So incredible stuff from George Russell to keep ahead
yeah,
of Sergio Perez. And on lap 10, Perez tried the move again, and this time he made it stick. And now
yeah,
going on to lap 12, we saw action further back. We saw Daniel Ricciardo trying to size up Carlos Sainz into turn 1. It was the outside line for Ricciardo, and he made it a really good move into turn 2. But on the exit of turn 3, Sainz had the switchback, and he got DRS because of that, where
yeah.
that detection point is. So Sainz was able to fight Ricciardo back, and Sainz went back up into the points in the sprint positions.
Yeah.
On lap 14, Ricardo tried to make the same move again, and this time he braked later too, and he made it stick all the way around the outside again. So another nice move from Ricardo, but again, Sainz fought him back, and Ricardo could not make it past.
Yeah, I think Ricardo should have been waiting a little bit, waiting. I mean, we know Ricardo was eager to get the move done, but he could have easily got it done coming down the retropasta and he could have made it stick. But now instead he was being put under pressure from Oscar Piastri behind as Piastri went down the inside of Ricardo on that same lap. So in the space of two corners, Ricardo had lost two places now, and he was being put under pressure from Gasly and Alonso and Stroll who were queuing up behind.
Yeah. So Ricardo ultimately lost out there, and we
Yeah,
waited to see whether he could make a move back again. And then
Yeah.
on that lap, we saw Fernando Alonso completely send it to the inside of Pierre Gasly at turn
Yeah.
12. So it was an opportunist move from Alonso, who was trying to fight back through the field. And he was making okay progress, but then he lost that when Gasly tried
Yeah.
to overtake him, and Alonso wouldn't give up though. Gasly had the outside line for turn 3 though, and ultimately he would get the place back from Alonso. Or no, Alonso fought it back though. So Alonso
Yeah.
went around the outside at turn 4, and he made it stick up into P11. So great driving from Alonso again.
Yeah. And moving on into lap 21 now, we saw Leclerc trying to get past Hamilton down the main straight into turn 1. Leclerc went down the inside of Hamilton and he was able to get that spot. And now Hamilton's line was compromised coming through turns 2 and 3. And now Yuki Tsunoda had the benefit of DRS and he was going wheel to wheel with Hamilton down the Retroposta. And Hamilton broke a little bit later around the outside and he was able to keep his P6 spot.
Good driving from Sonoda there. He
Yeah,
knew he was staying cautious though. He knew there were valuable points he couldn't throw away. So
yeah,
he waited his time on lap 22. He dispatched Lewis
yeah,
Hamilton, and on that same lap we saw Daniel Ricciardo also get past Oscar Piastri. So Ricciardo moved up into ninth,
yeah.
and Piastri moved up into or Sonoda moved up into sixth and gained an extra point for
Yeah.
Alpha Tauri.
Yeah, moving on into lap 24, the final lap, there was lots of battles going on. First up was Alonso and Piastri Alonso trying to get past Piastri into turn 1. Alonso sent it to the inside of Piastri and Piastri tried to get the switchback and it was a very nice move from Oscar Piastri who caught Alonso napping, I think, and Piastri was able to reclaim that 10th spot. And further up the field, we saw battles between Ricardo trying to put the pressure on Sainz for that final points paying position. But out in front, it was Max Verstappen who controlled the sprint race, and he would claim another win in Sao Paulo in the sprint race. And he won the Sao Paulo sprint ahead of Lando Norris, who came home in P2. Then came Sergio Perez to claim a much needed P3 in terms of his confidence.
Yeah, that gained a lot of confidence for Perez finally on the
Yeah,
podium again. And further back, we saw George Russell come fourth. Leclerc was fifth. Tsunoda gained valuable points for Alpha Tauri, and for the
yeah,
final podium or final points positions, Hamilton claimed seventh, and it was wheel to wheel between Sainz and Ricciardo across the line.
yeah,
Ultimately, Sainz held off Ricciardo, but it was impressive how Ricciardo gained 2 seconds in
yeah.
just one lap
He gained a
to
lot of
Carlos
time
Sainz. So
in one
Ricardo
lap.
was absolutely flying,
Yeah.
but nothing could stop Max Verstappen from taking another sprint win.
Yeah. So now moving on into the main Grand Prix, the Sao Paulo Grand Prix, where the big points were earned. But immediately on the formation lap, we saw Charles Leclerc absolutely bin it and throw it away after he lost, I think, power steering
He
was or
lost hydraulics,
hydraulics.
so it
Yeah.
wasn't his fault. But he said like,
He
"Why
was
am I
so
so
heartbroken on the radio saying like, why is he so
yeah?
unlucky
Why is
and
he so
everything.
unlucky?" It was thoroughly disappointing for
Yeah.
Charles Leclerc, who would have looked. I think he would have started
He would have
really
started
high up.
P2.
Yeah, he would have started on the front row, and so it was
Yeah.
absolutely disastrous for Charles Leclerc,
Yeah.
who was looking for a win, but ultimately his hydraulics let go at turn 6, and that sent him into the wall there.
Yeah.
Ironically, where he crashed last year
Yeah.
because of Lando Norris, but ultimately absolutely disastrous for Charles.
Yeah, so now moving on into the race now, the formation lap had to be aborted and they had to go through another one. And so as the lights came on now as the lights went out, we saw now there was an empty spot there on P2. So Alonso had a clear view ahead of him, but as the lights went out, Verstappen had a clear view ahead of him. But both Aston Martins seemed to have a terrible start as we saw Hamilton getting past Stroll and Norris getting past Alonso. So Norris looked to go down the inside, but further back there was mayhem that occurred, and we saw the Williams of Alex Albon spin and hit one of the Hasses it was into the wall, Haas of Kevin Magnussen into the wall, and we saw a tire fly off the car and hit a numerous amounts of cars, including Daniel Ricciardo's AlphaTauri. So there was a lot of drivers taken out, but through the retroposta, it was Verstappen from Norris, Hamilton, then came Alonso and Stroll, then Russell and Perez.
So basically, what happened in that
Yeah,
crash was that Hulkenberg got sandwiched by Magnussen and
yeah,
Albon, and so contact like Hulkenberg had in Qatar,
yeah,
Albon got sent flying out. He was out as well as Kevin Magnussen, and that tire carcass of Alex Albon. it went and hit
Yeah,
Hulkenberg, and then it hit Hulkenberg's tire, so it got flung up into the air, and
yeah,
then that tire hit Daniel Ricciardo's rear wing,
yeah,
so Ricciardo then had rear wing damage. But
yeah,
Oscar Piastri also had damage too because he got hit
yeah,
by Kevin Magnussen's out of control Haas, and
yeah,
so both of their cars had to be wheeled into the pits at the end of that
yeah,
lap one. And so what happened was a safety car had come out right after lap one, and Ricardo and Piastri had immediately pitted
yeah,
after lap one, and then the safety car came out. So other drivers had gone around another lap, and then the red flag came out.
yeah,
So ultimately, that left Ricardo and Piastri technically a lap down.
yeah,
And I don't know why the FIA didn't let them unlap themselves, but they didn't. And so Oscar Piastri and Daniel Ricciardo would take the restart a lap down, and that completely ruined both of their races, especially for Ricciardo, who had so much pace,
yeah,
considering he looked just as fast, even faster than Sonoda, who had picked his way through the melee, and he was
yeah.
all the way up there. So it was absolutely disastrous for Ricardo and Piastri, and I think that is a flaw in the FIA's rules because
Yeah.
that shouldn't be allowed because that ultimately ruined their race when they didn't even have a lap going.
Yeah, so after a long period of waiting at the red flag, it was time for the restart again. We were Verstappen on pole, and this time Norris on the front row in P2. So as the lights went out, it was a good start from Verstappen, who immediately covered off Lando Norris, and Norris was under pressure from Lewis Hamilton, who would try to go around the outside at turn one. Hamilton locked up, but Norris kept that spot in P2. So it was Verstappen from Norris, then came Hamilton, Alonso, Russell, then Perez, then Stroll, and then one of the Ferraris of Carlos Sainz. But it
Yep.
looked to be all smooth from there.
And then going down the retro Prosta, Fernando Alonso was sizing up
Yeah,
Lewis Hamilton, and into turn four, Alonso made a really good
yeah,
move to put himself into the podium places. So Alonso now was ahead of Lewis Hamilton,
yeah,
and Hamilton couldn't fight back. And then going on to lap eight, we saw surprisingly Lando Norris challenging Max Verstappen for the
yeah,
race lead. Norris tried to attack into turn one, but that compromised him on the exit. But then Norris had DRS down
yeah.
the retro Aposta, and could we possibly see Lando Norris taking the lead from Max Verstappen? He tried it around the outside, but Verstappen braked later and he held that position. Then after that, Verstappen just started flying
Yeah,
away.
yeah, typical Verstappen that we've seen so far. But moving on to lap 14, we saw Sergio Perez trying to attack George Russell and into turn one. Perez was able to get that spot up into P5. Russell would try to fight him back though with DRS coming down the Retroposta, and Russell used the DRS and was able to try to get past, but Perez braked a little bit later and was able to keep P6 or P5 from George Russell.
Yeah, and going on to the further back, we saw Ricardo had overtaken Oscar Piastri, and throughout this
Yeah,
whole race, both Oscar Piastri and Daniel Ricardo were keeping pace with the rest of the field.
yeah,
We even saw Ricardo staying right behind Yuki Tsunoda. So again, Tsunoda, who would have gotten points this weekend, if Ricardo hadn't been a lap down, we would have seen both double points for AlphaTauri. So
yeah.
again, just emphasizing how disastrous those rules were for both the Australians because it completely ruined their race.
Especially with Albon out for Williams in that battle at the bottom, and of course now with Williams' hopes just on Logan Sargent. And to be fair, Sargent was running a pretty decent race. I mean, he wasn't in the points, but he was. If like a Austin US GP disqualification happened again, then Sargent would be right there in a very comfortable spot based on where he was.
Exactly. Yeah. Moving on to lap 18, then we saw Perez go down the inside of Lewis Hamilton at turn one. So
Yeah,
turn one becoming a favorite overtaking spot. And on
yeah,
lap 18, Perez dispatched Hamilton, and again on lap 25, Lance Stroll made his way past George Russell into turn one. So Stroll got ahead of um of the one Mercedes on lap
yeah,
25, and on lap 27 he got ahead of the second Mercedes of Hamilton into turn one on lap
yeah.
27. So Stroll was making really good progress through the field.
Yeah, on lap 32, then we saw Pierre Gasly make his way past Valtteri Bottas as Pierre Gasly's teammate Ocon went up into the pits. So Gasly moved up into P9. So Bottas was dropped now to P10, and he'll be put under pressure from Logan Sargent back there. But now
Hmm.
moving on to lap 35, at the front we saw, or not at the front, a little bit in front of them, Carlos Sainz in P8 was now trying to get past George Russell, and even before they applied the brakes into turn one, Sainz was past one Mercedes, and he would be looking to put the pressure on the other Mercedes.
Yep, Sainz then got past George Russell into turn four, so it was a good move from Sainz
Yeah,
on lap 37. On lap 43, Pierre Gasly got past George Russell into turn one, so both Mercedes were falling hard and they were struggling for pace here in Sao Paulo after
yeah,
winning last year. Both of them just could
yeah,
not find any pace, and again on lap 50, Pierre Gasly was lining up Lewis Hamilton, and that pushed Hamilton down into ninth, with Russell not even in the points. So it was
yeah.
disastrous for Mercedes.
Yeah, and on lap 59, we saw George Russell was called into the pits, not for a pit stop, but to retire the car. So last year's race winner was now out after running in a points paying position. He was now out of the Grand Prix. And now moving on to the penultimate lap, we saw a fierce battle between Perez and Alonso for that final podium spot. And Perez sent it to the inside of Alonso into turn one. So Alonso was caught napping a little bit, but now down the Retroposta, Alonso used the DRS to close up to Sergio Perez again. Both drivers, both desperately needing podiums to bring some confidence back into their side of the garage on their teams respectively. And Alonso tried to go around the outside of Perez, but Perez just held him off.
Yeah, going on to lap 71 now. Alonso tried to, like you said, go.
Yeah,
On lap 71, Alonso tried to go around the outside of Perez into
yeah,
turn one, but that didn't work out for Alonso. But now going down the Retroposta, Alonso went around the outside of Sergio Perez and into the braking zone.
yeah,
Alonso went ahead of Sergio Perez, so
yeah,
Alonso had put his car back up into the podium places, and Lance Stroll, who had fought his way up, or who had actually lost places, though Stroll had maintained position and he was fit, so it would have been a huge haul of points for Aston Martin.
yeah. But out in front, it was Max Verstappen, that same old winner, dominating again. And as he came through now the final corner to win the Sao Paulo Grand Prix once again in his career and take another comfortable win for him and for Red Bull
17 wins in the
as he
season.
continued to break records and break that record. He's definitely set a statement here in Sao Paulo in the land of Lewis Hamilton. And P2 came Lando Norris after taking another well-respected drive for him and McLaren, another podium. Then we saw land another the fierce battle between Alonso and Perez as they were now going through the final corner. Perez now was, you could see him desperately trying to get on the power and try to apply the DRS as fast as possible and use all of his battery and drain it to the line, and he was closing and closing and closing, but he just couldn't get past Fernando Alonso by 5/100ths of a second. Alonso was able to claim another podium this season and a much needed podium for him and Aston Martin, and Perez had to settle for fourth. Then came Stroll in fifth, Sainz in sixth, Gasly seventh, Hamilton eighth, Sonoda ninth, and Ocon in 10th.
Yeah, disappointment for Mercedes in that
Yeah,
race. I think the losers ultimately were Mercedes, and who ultimately lost out. There were
yeah,
some winners though of Aston Martin, obviously,
yeah, McLaren.
McLaren too, and Alpine too, who brought home decent points. They brought home 7 points. Another
Yeah,
loser from that race was definitely Ferrari, because Sainz finished sixth and
yeah,
Leclerc couldn't even take the start. And
yeah,
Alpha Tauri was also a winner too, with Sonoda getting 2 points. And like I said
yeah,
before, it could have been double points if Ricardo wasn't a lap down.
yeah,
While McLaren won on one side of the garage, Piastri lost out too because again of the red flag. So it
yeah.
was definitely a crazy and hectic race.
Yeah, especially with Sargent just there in P11, Sonoda taking some much needed points for him and AlphaTauri. But yeah, that was it for a very crazy and chaotic Sao Paulo Grand Prix. And thank you guys for listening to this episode of our podcast. And be sure to join us next time as we take a look at the 2023 Las Vegas Grand Prix. Thank you.